Hello, global gardeners. Let's get your gardening week going. Nice to have everybody here today, and I'm happy to be here today. It is a beautiful day outside. I've already been out watering some of the seeds that I put in over this last week. Put some water in the beds in my greenhouse. I love this time of year when things start actually warming up and I can get out in the morning without having to bundle up from the freezing cold. So it's wonderful here in Colorado. I'm looking forward to having a wonderful gardening week, and I hope you are too. This time of year, I get a lot of questions from a lot of different people on a lot of different topics. And so today I want to try to answer as many of those questions as I can over the course of the next 90 minutes. And so throw your questions out there and we'll see how many we can cover. One of the ones I've been getting most recently is about yellowing leaves. If you're starting your seeds indoors for tomatoes and peppers, all the plants you're going to be transplanting out in the weeks ahead, it is completely normal for those first leaves to yellow, even turn brown, and even fall off the plant before you move it out to the garden. Those very first leaves, the cotyledon leaves, are the ones that are part of the germination process. And once the plant starts growing, their job is done. The true leaves show up, and they're the ones that really take over photosynthesis and gets the plant growing. So those first couple leaves only have a short lifespan, if you will, before their job is done, they turn yellow, they can fall off. So don't worry too much about it. If you're concerned about the color of your leaves, look low and look high. Those lower leaves are the oldest, and so they will age first. And even after you put them outside, those are the ones that are going to age and fall off first. As long as the new growth, the leaves that are emerging from the top of the plant are nice and green and healthy, then you're probably doing everything right. So look for the new growth to give you an indication of the overall health of the plant, and hopefully that'll alleviate some of your concerns. Jeremy's wondering, why are the gophers so cruel? I hear you. That's one of the problems I have here in my garden is gophers. The thing that I do, and a few of you have asked about this over the years, is I put wire fabric underneath all of my raised beds. That's a big reason why I do raised bed gardening, is to keep the gophers out of the bed. And so I have the barrier at the bottom so the gophers can't get in, because if you don't, they're cruel and they can definitely devastate the garden, especially eating those things that you want to keep, and they're going to pick those first of all. So you kind of have to live with it. Trapping doesn't necessarily work for a lot of pests like that, because in most areas, be it squirrels or gophers or deer, if you get rid of one or two, there are others waiting behind them to move right in. So I tend to go with the learn to live with it philosophy, and the way I live with my gophers is with those barriers. Moondust read online that cornflowers are a favorite for pollinators. I'd like to get some and plant them in a pot, but I don't want them spreading. Are they a weed? And so I like cornflowers. Cornflowers are a plant that I grow, not every year, but I do really like them. And yes, they can be good for pollinators. So as with any flower you're growing, the possibility exists that it can set seed, those seeds can spread, and any flower could potentially become a weed. I don't think necessarily that the particular cornflowers are any more of a weed than any others. They do reseed pretty well. If you don't want your flowers turning into weeds, if you don't want them taking over a particular garden bed, then deadhead. As soon as those flowers die off, they'll start to turn into the seed production phase. and just don't allow that to happen. So when the flowers fade, just cut them or pluck them. They cannot produce seeds at that point. And you don't have to worry about it spreading. You don't have to worry about it becoming a weed. Too often, and I'm very guilty of this, we leave the flowers on the plant past the point that they really need to come off. And then they turn to seed and then they spread. I don't mind spreading because most of the areas that I'm trying to establish my flowers in, I am looking forward to the reseeding. But if you don't want that, just remove the bloom so that the seeds won't fall and they won't reseed, and then it's not a problem as a weed. And that holds true with everything. Every flower that produces seeds, just deadhead, get rid of that flower and you really don't have to worry about it. Alex 209, do you recommend getting a grow light controller? And so I don't know that I would necessarily recommend it. A lot of it depends on your level of experience and what it is you're growing. I only have one of my grow lights that has a controller on it. All the other grow lights I have are a given amount of kelvins and watts, and it's standard and you can't adjust it. And I've been growing with those lights for years and years. If you're growing specialty plants that require different amounts of light or even different wavelengths at different times of their growth, then a controller might be useful because you can adjust how much light that plant is getting. And that's for those that are really keeping track of the growth phase of plants and how much light they need and are trying to get the blue wavelengths at one phase and the red wavelengths at another phase. And so for that, yes, I would recommend a controller because it can make the process a little bit easier if you're really trying to get that precision of light for your plant. But for most of us, for most of what we're growing indoors, I really don't think you need a controller. As long as you get a light that is strong enough for the plants that you're using underneath it, it should be fine. And it's a nice extra, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary. So specifically to your question, I don't think I would recommend it for most gardeners, but it is a nice option. Shandy's garden, with our terrible weather going up and down, how long would my plants have to be in the garage under lights again before I would need to harden them off a second time? So plants don't have a brain, but they are pretty smart. Once they get into that hardening off mode, there is cellular structure that happens within the plant. And so I'd like to harden my plants off for about a week at a time, but I've had my hardening off process interrupted. I've mentioned this in a video a few years ago. And so if you're planning to harden off for 5 days and at the 3-day point, you've got a freezing night and you have to bring your plants in and put them in your garage under lights, and it's going to be 2 or 3 days before you can get them back outside. When you do get them back outside, you can consider that first phase of hardening off already complete. And from what I find with the experience, because I've had to do this on a regular basis, is you don't need to start the clock over again. And so if you're planning 5 days, you use 3 days, and then you have to bring them inside, put them back out again and give them 3 days. I think there still is that time they need to acclimate to the weather. And I like to give them at least 1 full day of sun before I get them into a full nighttime phase. And so if you're interrupted, I would say a 3-day cycle is usually enough for most plants to continue the hardening off cycle. But there are lots of other factors involved: the weather, the wind, the plant, how big the plant is. So do look at everything while you're hardening off to determine how well they're doing. And more is better than less. If you can spend 7 days hardening off, your plants will probably appreciate it. Most plants, a 5-day cycle, even when it's interrupted, is usually pretty good. And I think it's one of those things you don't have to worry too much about it. Joanne Dawson, shishito peppers are on point. Thank you so much. Yeah, they're one of my favorites, and I made that video about the shishito peppers. I know many of you are growing shishitos now because they're so delicious. What do you think about canning them? And so generally, the thicker skinned or the thicker meat peppers do better if you can them. Shishito peppers, one of the reasons they're so tasty and so easy to fix for a snack is because they're very thin walled. And so while they can be canned, I would suggest that you probably eat them fresh. You could pickle them, and you could use water bath canning to seal the jars. But because they're so thin walled, I'm not sure how well they'll hold up to a process like that. The thicker walled peppers, like the jalapenos, for instance, and the peperoncinis, they tend to do a little bit better during the canning process. But even the peperoncinis have a pretty thin wall, and I've pickled them with no problems before. But I have tried to seal the jars that I pickled, and I don't think the peppers were as good as not canning. And so try it. It's if you're a canner and you have so many peppers that you want to can them, go for it. I would suggest doing a pickle, and maybe try the pickling first and just put them in the refrigerator without the canning process and see what you think of the pickled shishito peppers. I might give that a try this year. I hadn't really thought about it because I just like eating them so much when they're fresh. But it's one of those type of fruits that is so good fresh that I haven't had them pickled and I haven't had them canned, but I just can't imagine that they would be as good as they are fresh. And that's the way I look at most of my preservation and most of my canning. Am I improving the results by canning or by fermenting? And there are some, for instance, the jalapenos. Jalapenos raw are fine, but jalapenos after you've pickled them or canned them can be used in so many dishes in the future that it really does improve them by preserving them. That's kind of the way I look at it from that perspective. So I say give it a try. Start with a jar or two, see what you think, and then let us know what your results are. KT's wondering, can you start seeds in trays without grow lights? Don't have room for grow lights in the house, and which seeds can you do that if possible? So yes, most seeds can be started with no lights. There are some seeds, and usually the seed packet will say that it needs light for germination. And those are the seeds that are usually sown right on the surface of the soil, just lightly covered. Light can help germinate those seeds. But for all the rest of the seeds that we're growing, light is not needed for seeds to germinate. Anything that's going to be buried a 1/4 inch or deeper is in the dark. And so as long as it has the warmth and the moisture that's in the soil, it's going to start germinating. And so there are 4 things for the seedlings to grow. There's 3 things for it to germinate. So basically, a seed needs warmth, it needs moisture, and it needs oxygen. And then once the seedling starts growing, it needs light. And then once the true leaves develop, it needs nutrients. And so for that first phase where the seedling is just beginning to grow, it doesn't require light, but that's what happens to plants that once they break the surface and those cotyledon leaves emerge, suck up the light to start the photosynthesis to get the plant growing. If it doesn't have light, then it's going to search for it. And that's how the seedlings get leggy, get long and spindly, because there's not enough light. So during the germination phase, you don't have to worry about it at all. But as soon as the plants start growing, they are going to need light. And so you might need to modify where you're starting your seedlings. You might want to move plants around to windowsills and to other rooms that might have enough light to support them. But I think for most seedlings, the most important time they need light is during that very young seedling stage. Let's see. Jimmer's wondering, anyone have mole problems? That's one of the advantages of living in Colorado is we don't have moles, but they are very similar to gophers. And so if I had moles, I would definitely be doing a barrier at the bottom of my beds to keep them out at all possible. Two Gals is wondering, how do you best divide Greek oregano? Seems like it has runners. And so the Greek oregano, anytime that any of those stems fall down, it's not necessarily a runner, but the stems will actually root when they contact the soil surface. And that's one way to do it. You can just bend over those branches, put a little garden staple to hold them. They'll root in that spot, and you can dig them up and move those newly rooted branches anywhere in your garden. That's a very easy way to propagate them. You can also separate the plant into different sections from the main clump and repot those into other areas. But as a propagation method, letting them root and then snipping off that branch and planting it someplace else is a very, very easy method to do it. You can, and I've done it as well, if you got a big clump, go ahead and dig up the clump. Often the inside of a big clump will start to die off. That's another reason for most plants. If you're thinking about dividing it, look for the middle to die and then dig up the whole clump, divide it into 4 pieces or however many you want, and then replant each of those in other areas. And that can work pretty well with oregano. A lot of herbs have a similar process like that you can spread it around. And that's one reason why oregano spreads so easily as well and can take over a section, is because it roots so well. Patty's saying, I just ordered 12 early glow strawberry plants. I've never grown strawberries. Any quick general advice? I'm going to plant them in my plant tower. Thank you. You're welcome. So strawberries for most of us will do very well because they come back each year. First off, make sure you're putting them into good amended soil that can support them not only this year, but going into next year as well. They last about 3 years for most strawberry varieties before you need to think about replacing them. And so in a plant tower, that's a great option. And be aware that probably in about 2 years, 3 years on the outside, you'll need to replace all of those plants. Consider giving them space if you're growing them any place besides the tower so that the runners can spread, and buying 12 strawberry plants, in a couple years, you can have 100 strawberry plants with no problem if you root up those runners. But growing in a tower really reduces that possibility. So when the runners appear, go ahead and prune them off, and that'll put all the energy into flower and fruit production. So for open beds, I suggest let some of the runners go and root and spread out and fill in the space. But for containers, like in a tower system, I suggest pruning off those runners, and because they're not going to be rooting anywhere and they're taking energy away from the plant. And depending on what zone you're in, Patty, I have tried growing strawberries in my zone 5B green stalk garden, and they didn't make it through the winter. Whereas this morning on the Facebook, I saw some wonderful pictures of how well strawberries can grow in the green stalks. Just be aware you may need to bring them into a sheltered area or cover them over the winter if you're any colder than zone 6. And zone 7 and above should be no problem overwintering strawberries in a tower system. So I would love to have an entire tower of strawberries, and that's what I tried last year. My winters are just too cold. It just doesn't work real well. Moondust is wondering, do pollinators like snapdragons? I have some snapdragon flower seeds I would like to plant. I like snapdragons. I got snapdragons in my front yard. There are some pollinators that are attracted because of their design. Most of the pollinators that we are attracting to our garden are most attracted by the open petals of something like a coneflower, or that even the salvia that does have some tubular flowers will attract it. And so color is an important factor. Snapdragon isn't high on the list for pollinators, but it's such a beautiful flower. And in the plant, I just loved snapdragons, that I suggest growing it even if it isn't the best pollinator plant. But there are some pollinators that will benefit from it. Almost every flower we could grow in our garden will benefit some insect. And so I suggest lots of variety when you're growing your flowers because of that. You may be targeting certain pollinators with certain flowers, and there are others waiting in the wings to find your garden if you just add some variety and add some different types of flowers and grasses and herbs that would benefit all insects. Good morning to you, Joe Riddle in West Virginia. Questions about Three Sisters planting. Is it intended for dried beans and corn, or for picking and eating, canning fresh produce? Would it be a tangled mess for picking? Excellent question. And I've actually started making this video 3 times in the last 3 years because I think there's a common misconception about the Three Sisters garden. And so the Three Sisters garden is basically where you're growing corn, and corn grows vertically. And then you grow beans around those corn stalks, and the beans will grow up the corn stalk and use it as a trellis. And then you plant squash at the base to cover the soil surface and act as a living mulch to help keep everything nice and moist and help keep the weeds out. And it's as simple as that. But to your question, I think the traditional Three Sisters garden really is intended for letting those plants grow to their entire life cycle, which means dried beans in particular, and the corn when it's fully ripe, and by then the squash is ripe. The problem that I see, particularly in a bed, as you say, a tangled mess, it can become a tangled mess. And so at mid-season, if you want to harvest fresh beans, well, you have to walk through the squash plants, and you're interrupting the potential growth of the corn plants to harvest those beans. Whereas if you just let everything grow from start to finish, then about the time that you are harvesting the squash, the beans have dried. And I think this is even intended for growing a corn that you would be using to make flour or cornmeal. And so it's an issue with the life cycles of the 3 plants. They have 3 different harvest periods if you're trying to harvest them fresh. If you just let them go, you don't have to worry about it becoming a tangled mess, because at the end of the season, everything is all ready to pick. It's dried. The squash is ready to go. I think this works really well with a winter squash, so you can pick it and store it. And that's the basic way that I think historically the Three Sisters gardens were grown. You're growing 3 crops that are going into storage for the winter to make the cornmeal, to have the dried beans that you can then reconstitute to eat, and to have a winter squash that is storing well to be eaten years later. For a small bed with just a few corn stalks and limited space, then sure, by all means, harvest the beans when they're fresh, and harvest the corn when it's ready, and then harvest the squash at the end of the season. And especially if you're doing a lot because you want to do canning, then you're going to want to harvest it when it's fresh. But if you're just looking at preserving it, well, then think in terms of preserving the dried beans and the dried corn, and then the squash with whichever way you want. So there's no hard rule about a Three Sisters garden. I just think in general practice it can be more of an issue if you're trying to eat everything fresh than if you just let it go and eat it all at the end. And that's one of those things that actually can make it a little more easy when it comes to how we garden. Susan says, due to family issue, I had seed potatoes planted in grow bags in a garage in dry soil for 3 days. I'm planning to move outside and water with hopes for the best. Any thoughts? Yeah, they should be fine. The nice thing about seed potatoes is in most cases they can last a long time doing nothing. And so even though the soil is dry, it might have desiccated them a little bit, but as long as it was a good chunk of potato, there's still enough energy in there that when you start watering again and the soil becomes moist, it should sprout and it should grow. Think about those seed potatoes and how long they've been sitting before they got to you. And for you to have an extra 3 days in dry soil really shouldn't create that big a problem. So I say go forward with your plan and start getting them watered. I hope your family issues are resolved and you can start getting those plants growing. And they'll probably surprise you. Potatoes are really hardy in that respect. I've found, in fact, I just found a couple this last week, seed potatoes that were in a box. I thought I'd gotten all of my seed potatoes out. They've just been sitting in a box and waiting for me to come to them for a couple weeks now. And I'll put them in the ground and I'll water them and they'll be fine. So it's one of those things. Potatoes are very forgiving. Big old Joe, I put some tomatoes out yesterday to harden off and I forgot them. They look good. Should I leave them or bring them anyway? I would go ahead. Depends on how cold the nights are getting for you in particular and how harsh the days are. They can handle the stress of a day or two when you forget them outside. I just like to baby my plants a little bit more, so I would consider bringing them in today and just giving them a break from all that stress that they encountered on the day that you left them outside, and then just get back to your normal hardening off cycle. As long as they don't have damage from freezing temperatures at night, and as long as they haven't got sunburn and the leaf edges are starting to turn brown and black, then they're going to be okay. Just give them a breather, give them some rest so that their cells can recover and rejuvenate, and then put them back outside. Depending on how moderate your temperatures are, if it's an overcast day, if it's not real windy, if it's not overly hot, and if it's not going to be extra cold tonight, then yeah, you might consider leaving them out. But I like to err on the safe side just because my conditions are excessively hot and cold at night and windy, and my plants usually need that extra time when it comes to hardening off. CJ, it may be a rational fear, but I'm not sure how to plant my 6 variety basil, start or direct sow. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's irrational necessarily. Most of what our fears are in gardening have some basis in that fear being there. I would say it's probably a fear you don't need to have, and you could do it either way. I've got basil that's growing in little pots that I started in flats right now, and they're doing fine, but that's because my winter is so long and my spring is so short that I need to get my plants out as soon as possible. And I want to have a tower of basil in my green stock. So I've got 12 different varieties of basil so that when the weather warms up a little bit more, I can put them all out at the same time in my green stock tower, and they're growing. That's an option. But I also have basil seed that I'll be direct sowing in about a month when the ground is warm enough and my temperatures stabilize during the night and day. So I think that's more of a factor. Don't look at it as a fear. Look at it as, when do you want those plants, and can your weather support the growth of those plants? So if it's still too cold for basil where you live, then start them indoors and then put them out as a transplant. If you're already getting good warm days and warm nights and your soil temperature is good and the soil is ready, then go ahead and direct sow. And the difference is that whatever you start indoors, it's going to be 3, maybe 4 weeks before you can put them outside. Whereas whatever you start with direct sowing outside, in that same 3 or 4 week period, they're already outside and they'll be actively growing. So why not do both? Just so you can get some experience to see which works best for you. Take some of the seeds and start them indoors. And then when it's ready, take some of the seeds and put them outside and see if you note a difference and if you have a preference between the two. But don't worry about it being an irrational fear. Just move forward and make it happen, and I'm sure you'll do fine. And the nice thing about most basil seed packages is there are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of seeds in a packet. So even if it doesn't work out as you hoped, you've got enough seeds that you should be able to recover, and they'll be fine. AGB says, I purchased some leggy basil, hoping I could rescue them. I trimmed off to the bottom 2 leaves. Will they revive? And so they should. Do look. So when you look at a basil plant, where the leaves are, you can see the node where new branches will grow. And so if you look at a main stem of basil and where the leaf comes out, you can actually see that little node grow into a new branch. And as soon as you prune, that node wakes up and it stimulates the growth of those side branches. So as long as you can see that those nodes are there and that little leaves are starting to emerge, then yes, it will revive and you can expect more branches and a bushier plant. If you don't see that node and if you don't see that growth, then that means you probably pruned too much and it's not going to recover, because that's where the future growth of the plant comes. So take a close look and you'll be able to answer the question yourself. As within a day or two, you'll see those leaves start to emerge from that junction of where the stem was and where the leaves are. And then you can grow the plant and continue. That's one way to get a really big bushy basil plant, is just to keep topping it, keep cutting back the tips, and you cut it back to that junction of the 2 leaves, because that's where the 2 new branches will appear. And as long as you see that growth, you really can chop a plant and expect it to recover in most cases without too much difficulty. Jenny's wondering about terra preta. They found algae in the soil. I'm wondering if you think it's possible to inoculate biochar with algae like bacteria, fungus, spirulina thrives in alkaline. And so for those of you who don't know terra preta is a very famous area in the Amazon region of South America, hundreds of years old. And basically the indigenous people that lived in that area would bury and burn plants, dried plants, and what was created was this really deep layer of what we now think of as biochar, basically charcoal that is buried underground. And so the biochar has developed with that same thought in mind, that if you burn in a very low oxygen environment, like they think they did in terra preta, it creates this material that we in the garden community use as biochar, that is basically just a carbon shell. And within that carbon shell are thousands, if not millions, of little air pockets. And those air pockets can now hold bacteria, fungi, nutrients, water. And so I have a video that I did a few years ago when I was first setting up my garden and I was adding biochar to my beds, and I talk about the benefits of biochar. It's one of those soil amendments that you add once because it isn't organic as we think of organic. It's not going to decompose. It's organic because it's carbon-based, but what remains is just that carbon shell, and that carbon's going to be there for as long as you're gardening. And so what we do with the biochar is we have to fill those pore spaces with something when we put it into our soil. And so algae will typically, it's think of it as a plant. It needs light to grow. And so if you remove light from the algae, it's not going to grow. And so while you could inoculate the biochar with algae, as soon as you bury the biochar, that algae is going to die and then just become nutrients for all the soil microbes that are already there. So the bacteria that we most often inoculate biochar with doesn't need the sunlight. And so that's why we can use the bacteria, and it will benefit the soil. The same with any fungal spores that we use to inoculate the biochar. But when we're using a living plant like algae that needs the light, then it's really not going to work. So you can try it. You're basically just adding organic matter to the soil, but I would focus instead on a nutrient-rich liquid with the bacteria and the fungal aspect as being the primary focus when you want to inoculate biochar. CJ's wondering, I wonder if you could dry the peppers and store them like sun-dried tomatoes. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I've been working on this video for a couple of months now. I dry a lot of peppers. I did try drying my my jalapeno peppers, my Anaheim peppers, the shishito peppers, the cayenne peppers. All of them dried, air dried naturally pretty well, except the shishitos. The shishitos, because of that really thin wall, don't dry as well. And so I've stopped drying my shishito peppers. But it's worth a try. They might do a little bit better in a dehydrator as opposed to the air drying, but it is a possibility. It's one of those things that there are preservation methods that work better, like I was saying before, for some of the plants that we're growing. And I think that was in reference to the shishitos, wondering whether you could grow them or not. They're just so good fresh that's my preferred method of getting those peppers into my belly. Okay, let's see. Nice to see so many of the regulars here. Happy May Day to Urban Chicken Mama. It is May Day for any of those of you that are used to celebrating. I never really grew up in an area with a maypole. I do remember a couple times in elementary school where we would go out on May Day with long ribbons on the tall pole, and we would weave all of we school kids in a circle and make the decoration on the maypole. But I don't really see much of that anymore. So I know there are different regions and different countries where it's a bigger deal than here in the States, but it's May Day. So if you celebrate May Day, I hope it's a wonderful day for you. Jimmer Trefty, I love zucchini. So do I. Can you grow them in 5-gallon buckets? Oh yeah, absolutely. I would grow one zucchini in a 5-gallon bucket. They can get a pretty substantial root system if they're happy. I've mentioned this before, a gardener I know that grows everything in 5-gallon buckets. Tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, corn. He doesn't have a space to put an in-ground garden, doesn't have a spot for raised beds, and he just lines his driveway up with 5-gallon buckets and grows everything. So yeah, you could definitely grow zucchini in a 5-gallon bucket. If they're happy, the plant can get pretty big and bushy, and that's why I would limit it to just one in a bucket. And that holds true for grow bags too. You can definitely grow squashes in grow bags, and to include the big long vining pumpkins. Pumpkins can be grown in a grow bag as well. Just be aware that as the plant gets bigger, in most container gardening processes, fertilizer is usually needed mid-season, maybe at the end of the season as well, because in a small space like that, the nutrients are probably going to be sucked up by the plant pretty quickly. But try it. Bucket growing and container growing can really add a whole new level to your gardening, and it can really teach you a lot about the gardening you do in raised beds or in the ground. I don't want to necessarily say is always easy, but can be really easy once you get the soil life and all the nutrients and a nice balance, and you're using your mulches and you've got your watering pattern. It becomes pretty easy because we do it so regularly. if you don't do container gardening, throw in some containers, because you're going to have to water more often and you're going to have to be more concerned about the nutrients. And so that's why I say it adds a new level to your gardening, because they tend to be a little more difficult than the regular plants that we're growing in the ground and we just water and everything's good. JB Walker, how do I know when it's time to pull the strawberries? Do they just stop producing? I have my bed in an open ground bed. Yeah, they stop producing. So for most of the varieties that we're growing in our garden, in the first year, you can expect some flowers and some strawberries. And it varies slightly from whether it's a June-bearing strawberry or an ever-bearing strawberry. But you can expect some strawberries in that first year. In the second year, that's usually the most productive year. And so you can expect a lot of flowers and a lot of strawberries. And then in that third year, you're going to see less. The production is going to be less than the peak year. And every year after that, you're going to have less. And so you can look at it from that perspective. Just keep growing until you notice a very clear difference in how much they're growing, and then pull them. Or just get on a 3-year cycle. And so I've got a couple beds that I am still planning to build and plant as my main strawberry beds. And what I plan, and I'll of course show all this in a video, is I'll put the plants in 1/3 of the bed in the first year. And then I'll add plants by using the runners in the second third in the second year. And then in the third year, I'll take the runners and I'll fill that third space. And then with that thought in mind, you just rotate. And so in that third year, that first section that I planted is pulled and I put new plants in. And then in the fourth year, that middle section is pulled and I put new plants in. And that's one way to just get on a regular cycle, always knowing when to replace your strawberries and being ready by potting up those runners to put them into whichever section is going to be replanted. So that's one way. Do it by the calendar. And the other is, as you asked, yes, they just stop producing. And so go ahead and replace them at that point. That's a clear indicator that they are done with their life. They'll keep growing. The crown usually gets pretty woody and they won't be sending out as many of the runners. That's another indicator that usually happens about the third year, maybe the end of the second year, is a lot of runners are being sent out. The plant knows it's dying, so it just sends out a whole bunch of runners. So if you've got strawberry plants this year, I think last year I counted one of my plants, and last year was the third year from some that I had planted when I first moved into this house. And I had 18 runners coming off of one strawberry plant. And that's an indicator that it knows it needs to propagate. And so it's putting all of its energy into the new runners. And that's one reason you're not getting the fruit production, because it's in survival mode and it's telling you its life is coming to an end. So use that to your advantage. Wasabi Gal's wondering if you can grow strawberries and asparagus together. You can. I'm hesitant to grow many plants in my asparagus beds just because the asparagus needs room to move throughout the bed. The roots are going to expand. It's going to send up spears. And if you've got another plant that's taking up a lot of room in that bed, it could interfere with those spears that want to grow in the springtime. So when I get asked this question, and I think I talked about this a couple weeks ago, I would suggest you growing strawberries around the edge of the bed and have your asparagus in the middle of the bed. And when the asparagus starts moving to the edges, then you can go ahead and start pulling the strawberries. So yes, they can be grown together. The strawberry roots tend to be shallow and the asparagus roots tend to be deeper. And so they're not going to conflict in that respect, but they are going to compete for nutrients. And that's one of the biggest issues when you're growing plants in a perennial bed, a perennial meaning like asparagus that comes back every year, or even the strawberries that come back every year, is it's difficult to add the nutrients on a yearly basis because you can't get in there and amend the soil. You can't dig in the compost. So you have to do top dressing, put the compost on the top or put the nutrients on the top for them to feed the bed. And the strawberries will be competing with the asparagus for those nutrients. So you can do it together. I would just caution you to make sure they're really not competing with each other. B. Willis says, I'm a new veggie gardener. Congratulations. The cucumber seed packets indicate to plant the seeds in groups. I don't understand what that means. You know, this is one of those things that goes back generations, and I don't fully understand what it means. So there are a lot of squashes and cucumbers. They'll tell you to plant in a mound. So you're supposed to mound the soil and then put, depending on what the packet says, 3 seeds, maybe as many as 6 seeds in that mound. And then that's all they tell you. And I think that's one of those things like you're concerned with, is it doesn't answer what's going to happen next. Well, you'd go to a different source that tells you how to plant your zucchini or your cucumbers, and it will tell you to plant 6 inches apart and then thin to 12 inches apart. And so now we have guidance from one source that says our cucumber plants should be 12 inches apart, and then from another source that implies we can grow 6 cucumber plants that are only separated by 3 or 4 inches. The key point, I think, and this goes back to the concept of overseeding, and maybe those days when the seed wasn't as reliable. So you would put 6 cucumber seeds in the ground, and maybe 3 of them would germinate. And over the course of the cycle of that plant, of those plants, 1 would die. And so now you're left with 2 cucumber plants per mound that you plant in. And those plants might be separated by 6 to 10 inches, and they'll do just fine. If you are being told by the seed packet to plant them in groups, realize that cucumbers really can't grow that close together. They do need some space. They do need nutrients, especially when they're going to grow into long vines with lots of fruit on them. I typically grow my cucumbers 12 to 15 inches apart, but that's because I'm growing them vertically up a trellis. If I was going to let them spread across the ground, I'd be growing the cucumbers 15 to 18 inches apart because those vines are going to need room to spread. So yes, you can start sowing them in a group, but be aware you're going to have to come back and thin out that grouping to leave yourself with just 1 or 2 plants in whichever given space you're looking to grow them in. So it can be confusing because I think a lot of the information is based on days when we doused our gardens with fertilizer, and you can grow almost anything real close together if you're putting a whole bunch of fertilizer on it. And that's another aspect that's left out with the conversation in those seed packets, is they might be assuming that you're going to be fertilizing those plants from that point forward. I encourage the good, healthy soil so you don't need all that extra fertilizer, and my cucumbers do just fine being spaced 12 to 15 inches apart, growing vertically on a trellis with good soil, and I'm not adding fertilizer during the course of the season. And my cucumbers are great. You can see the videos I've done on cucumbers from that perspective. So hope that helps. Just be ready to thin out those cucumbers if you already started them in a group. If you didn't, go ahead and space them out at planting, because nowadays our germination rate on seeds is going to be above 90%. And so I think some of those old assumptions that we needed to start more seeds than we were going to grow because of faulty germination, I think that assumption just doesn't hold true anymore. And so it's one of those things that we need to modify how our parents or grandparents might have gardened. And I think the seed companies are still kind of a generation or two behind with some of that kind of stuff. Okay, so it looks like In the Garden with Eli and Kate has joined us. Always nice to see you here. Of course, so many regulars. It's just so nice to, and I say this all the time. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I just love my Mondays and starting off again with all of you to get my gardening week started. I got a lot done this last weekend and over the course of the last week. I'm thinking, this is one of those springtime. We want to get out. We want to get our plants out. We want to start growing. I have a couple of the tomatoes that I showed in one of the videos I did with Eli and Kate that I'm growing in red cups. And they're ready for transplanting. But I'm a month away from when I normally put my plants out. But I've been putting a lot of water and rock in my greenhouse, and it's actually holding pretty stable. And my nights are not getting that cold. So I'm really tempted over the course of the next couple of days to put some of my tomato plants in that red cup in the greenhouse and start growing them. So it's going to be more of a test because I know cold weather is coming. It's going to happen. It always does. But I'm kind of putting faith into my greenhouse and all the work I've done to get my tomatoes growing a whole month early. So keep your fingers crossed for me. The plants themselves are just getting too big to stay in containers under lights indoors. So even if they don't make it, at least I'll have learned something about what the capabilities are of my greenhouse, and it'll either solidify some of the information, some of my fears, or give me hope that maybe in the future I can be growing in the garden, in my greenhouse, a full month earlier than the garden. So we'll see. If it works, you'll definitely know about it. So, okay. I know I'm way behind on some of the comments because I still see some stuff about the green or about the Three Sisters. So I'm going to go ahead and move down. Bowtie Life, glad you made it. Everyone's good today, I hope. Always nice to see you here. I know you've missed some of the lives and you like to catch in the replay. So hopefully you'll be able to stay as long as you can, even if it is just the first half hour. Shandy's Garden, how do you feel now about your harvest dried freeze dryer? Have you tried flowers? I hope you plan on making a blooper reel out of things that don't freeze dry too great. I love it. And actually I'm doing a lot in my freeze dryer beyond the gardening. So now that the gardening season is starting, you'll be seeing more videos with my freeze dryer as I preserve some of my harvests. But I've been freeze drying mangoes and strawberries and pineapple, a lot of the things I get at the store, and I freeze dry them, and they're fantastic snacks. I don't really have a blooper reel because things haven't necessarily gone bad, but I have shot some video, and I'll probably dub over what I had said. I freeze dried my cherry tomatoes and they got all foamy. And I thought something was wrong with the way that the cherry tomatoes would freeze dry. And I'm still going to do that video with the cherry tomatoes. It'll probably come out next month. And I'll be making tomato powder with it. And that'll be the first of the freeze drying videos that I'm doing this year. Well, since then, I've freeze dried all kinds of stuff. I freeze dried eggnog over Christmas. I've freeze dried pudding. I've freeze dried candies of different type. And so Skittles, if you know the little candy Skittle, when you freeze dry Skittle, it kind of pops open. It explodes. It doesn't explode like blow out everywhere, but it splits and enlarges. It gets foamy on the inside. And what I've learned is that's what sugar does. When sugar is freeze dried or something that has a lot of sugar in it, it gets foamy, and it's a hard foam. It's not like a soft foam. And so that's what happened with my cherry tomatoes. They were so sweet. I was doing the sun gold. was so much sugar in those cherry tomatoes that when I freeze dried them, that sugar during the freeze drying process just kind of bubbled out as a foam. I thought it was a blooper at the time. I thought something had gone wrong, but now I realize that it was perfectly normal. And so that's why I say I'll probably dub over that footage when I release that video, because I'll explain that it is perfectly normal for the sugars to appear that way in whatever it is you happen to be doing. And so if there are bloopers, then yeah, I might consider a blooper reel, but I've been very happy with it, and things are going so well that I really have no complaints about anything having gone wrong. I love those freeze-dried snacks. And so if you don't know the Harvest Right freeze dryer, I've got a link in the description below. It's the one I made a few videos about last year, and we'll be making more. And they're at the top of the home freeze dryer world. So if you're looking for one, click on that link, even to just think about it and do some research. It really is cool. So yes, I really do like it. Diana 2, do you know of a source for mullein and comfrey plants? And so I'm not aware of a source for plants. Most of those you're going to have to get a seed. And so if you do a quick search, especially with the comfrey seed online, there are, I can't think of the name off the top of my head, but there's an herbal seed company that sells both of those, I'm pretty sure. And I know there are 2 or 3 companies that I've bought seed from that will sell both the mullein and the comfrey seeds. You might be able to find the mullein seed from one of the native plant seed companies. But just do a quick search for buying comfrey seeds, and you'll be able to see those companies. I'm not aware of anyone. I tried doing searches because I get asked that question quite a bit, because I've got a couple comfrey videos, and you can't find a comfrey plant. I've looked at all of my local nurseries. I've looked at nurseries online, and that's just one of those things you have to grow from seed. So be aware of that, and they do grow pretty well from seed. So find a source that you like and get the seeds and go ahead and start them, typically indoors in a pot, and then you can transplant them outside. The mullein, I've planted mullein from seed before without starting indoors. In fact, mullein, I think, has a pretty big tap root, so they'll probably do best if you direct sow them outside. But definitely start from, there it is. Sunset Gazing says strictly medicinal seeds. That's one of the ones I know definitely has the seeds of comfrey. And I've grown some, or I've bought some of their seeds, and they've done well. So there's one chance. Booty Yoga, I assume Thai basil requires more sun since it's from tropical Thailand, where other basil's Mediterranean. So Mediterranean plants get a lot of sun as well. Basil, generally, whether it's the Thai basil, lemon basil, pineapple basil, the Mediterranean varieties of basil, they all require about the same amount of sun. So I wouldn't necessarily say that Thai basil requires more, and I don't even really think it does better if it gets more. As long as they're getting good, solid 6 to 8 hours of sunlight minimum, all basil are going to do fine. But that is a good assumption, and that holds true for a lot of plants. If they grow in a subtropical or tropical region, they often will need more sunlight than Mediterranean or northern region plants, but not always, because some of those tropical plants are used to growing at the floor of the jungle, and they don't like any sunlight at all, or just dappled sunlight. So it does make a difference. But the Thai basil, I grow here in my Colorado garden, and it does just fine. Now, granted, I'm farther north than some of those tropical regions, so my summer may actually give me a little bit more light. And so that could be one explanation for why they do so well. But full sun, for those type of plants, and an hour or two difference really doesn't make that big a difference. So Yankee Sista, hello to you. I need to evict my peppers. Still having some cool nights, so I thought of placing them in my cold frame lined with leaves. Your thoughts? Yeah, absolutely. So the leaves will be acting as an insulation as opposed to a heat generator. But yeah, if you need space and you need to move plants out and it's still too cold, think about your cold frame. I would suggest if you have a thermometer to put in the cold frame, put it out today, measure what the temperature is tonight. Before you go to bed, check the temperature in your cold frame. First thing in the morning when you get up, check the temperature in your cold frame. And if it looks like it's suitable for peppers, then evict those peppers and put them out into the cold frame. The leaves will act as insulation around the edges to help hold in some of that heat, but you still, I would suggest, should do a temperature of that cold frame so that you don't assume it's warm enough and then you put the peppers in and the nights are still too cold. So go with that. So in the garden with Eli and Kate, can I be cheeky and ask a green stock question? By all means. Wondering how folk have fared with bell peppers, full-size plants. Do they do okay in a green stock? Yeah, absolutely. I grew my shishito peppers in a green stock last year, full-size plants. I grew jalapeno peppers. I don't grow a lot of bell peppers, but I've grown a lot of peppers in my green stock and they do just fine. I grow one plant per pocket and I put them in the lower levels. If you need to, you can tie them up, but the plants are sturdy enough that they do just fine and I wouldn't worry about it. So yeah, that's actually one of the plants I am doing regularly with my green stock. I'm planning on doing shishito peppers again this year, along with some of the other. I'm actually planning, since I got so many of my super hot peppers, I'm planning on doing some of the super hots in at least one of the green stocks. So go for it, Eli and Kate, if you're listening in, and experiment with it. That's one of the nice things about having a green stock is you can experiment and see what works and what doesn't work. Like I mentioned earlier, the strawberries didn't do well for me because my winters are just too cold. But I bet you in Scotland, strawberries would actually do pretty well in a green stock. So consider putting some of those in as an experiment as you start them for the first time and see which ones you really like. Bettina says beets, radishes, bok choy, spinach, lettuce, herbs, carrots in a green stock. Yeah, I've done radishes, I've done bok choy, I've done spinach, I've done lettuce, I've done a lot of herbs. I haven't done the carrots yet in a green stock, but I've got some short carrots this year that may actually find a home in it. So almost everything you're going to grow in your garden in a raised bed or in a container of any type, you can definitely grow in a green stock without too much issue. So let's see. Oh, I saw a reference to, boy, a lot of people talking to Eli and Kate. That's fantastic. UP Gardner, thank you for that super sticker. I appreciate the contribution to the channel. It's always nice to feel the love. Thank you so much for that. And we're already an hour into this. Usually this is about the point that I talk about the background. And some of you may have noticed that this is the same background I've had for a couple weeks now. That's because this is my garden. And this is one of my happy photos because the garden was just looking so wonderful at this time. And I can look at it. And right now, nothing is growing in my garden. I take it back. Some of the things have started to grow. The currants are growing. The rhubarb is growing. The comfrey is growing. The asparagus is growing. I saw my very first mint pop up this morning when I was out there. The horseradish is growing. So I have plants growing, but nothing as lush and green as the photo that I have behind me from last year. And so one of the reasons I have this photo and why I'm bringing this up now is because I want your photos. If you want to be in the background for the Monday live stream, send me your photo. Gardener Scott at gardenerscott.com is where you send it to. And do give me permission to use your photo. I get photos, and unless you specifically say that I have the permission to use it, and on the live stream, I'm not going to use it on the live stream. And it's just as simple as that. And I appreciate getting photos and having conversations about plants. But when it comes to this public forum, I want to make sure that I'm not going to embarrass anybody because you didn't want your photo shown. And then tell me something about it. Tell me something about your garden. Tell me about what you did, what you're doing, about the plants. And then I'll pop it in the background. And now that we have people growing plants that you can actually hopefully be proud of, share it with the rest of us. So send it to gardenerscott@gardenerscott.com, and maybe next week we can start getting some of those other photos up in the background. And so, photos like this are happy photos. Sure, I can look at it and see the weeds, and I can see that it's getting towards the end of the season and some of the plants are starting to fade, but it's also a photo I can look at and think, yeah, it's going to be soon that my garden will be looking like that this year. And that's really what I'm looking forward to, is the garden looking nice and green and lush for this year as well. Tim Collins is wondering, if you had 2 garlic growing from a single spot, would you cull one to let the other grow on? Yes, usually I would, especially when you're growing 2 plants side by side. And that holds true for most plants, but especially for the root plants. Beets definitely fall into this category. If you grow beets and you let all those little beet roots grow from a single spot, you're going to end up with small beet roots. If you want a big beet root, you got to pull out the ones that are interfering. Same holds true with garlic. If you want a big bulb, then you need to prune out one of the ones that is interfering. So choose the biggest one and the healthiest one and pluck the other, and you'll have better results. That way it will grow on into a bigger one. If you don't like doing that, you don't like culling the plants, you can let them both grow, and they should both grow, but you'll have small bulbs. And so it's really what you're trying to get. If you want to grow plants, then let the plants grow. If you're trying to harvest the garlic to use, then you got to kill some plants along the way. Dylan Gray, I have beds that I didn't mulch. Should I weed them, leave the weeds, and then cover with fresh soil, or compost the weeds? I'd say compost the weeds. A lot of people think you can't compost weeds. The issue is that if you compost weeds that have gone to seed, then you're incorporating that weed seed into your compost. And when you use the compost, there's the likelihood that you're spreading that plant to other sections of the garden. But especially early in the season, before any seeds have developed on those plants, pull them, throw them in the compost pile. Most of the greens that go into my compost pile are the weeds that I pull, especially this time of year. So absolutely, that's definitely an option. I would still consider mulching the bed. And now, depending on when you're going to plant, having plants growing in a garden bed is a good thing, even if they are what you consider weeds. As those roots grow, they are improving the soil. They're helping the soil life. And I actually pulled out some of the dried roots from the tomato plants last year when I was cleaning up the garden in one section, the covered area with the white hailcloth. I just cut the tomato plants off, left the roots in the ground. And then a month or so ago, when I was starting to amend some of those beds, I pulled up those dried, dead tomato roots, and they were covered with earthworms. There's life in your soil that is using the roots of all those plants in your soil. So yes, there is that option to leave the weeds in place, but depending on the type of weed and depending on what you're going to be growing in that bed, at some point you may want to cut back or pull out the weed, and then absolutely put them in the compost pile. You don't have to worry about the seeds, and it is a great nitrogen source for your compost. Mitten BBQ, hello to you. I'm making my first compost tea this Wednesday with distilled water, worm castings, kelp meal, blackstrap molasses, and an air pump. Should I apply with a watering can or pump sprayer? And so it sounds like this is going to be a really healthy and bacterial rich tea, and how you apply it will, or the reason you're applying it will make a difference on how you use it. So when I make a compost extract, I typically don't go to all the trouble of adding all the ingredients you do, especially with the bubbler, to make a classic compost tea. I put it in a watering can and then I water with it because I want some of that material that hasn't been fully eaten yet to act as extra amendment for my beds. If you're going to use a sprayer, you're going to have to filter out the tea. That's going to get rid of some of those solids, and I like having those solids in my beds. So if you're after just the bacteria that are going to be in the liquid, then you filter it and you can use a pump sprayer, because typically the nozzle for the sprayer will get clogged up if you don't filter it first. And then you spray that as a foliar feed, or you can spray it to help cut back on some of the fungal diseases. That's a big reason for spraying with a compost tea. But if you're doing it for the soil amendment, I would put it into a watering can, water, and get some of the solids from that tea into the soil as well, because they'll continue to break down and they'll continue to act as food for all the other microbes in the soil as well. And it's easy. It's one of those things that it's easy when you just pour it into a watering can and water. I'm too lazy sometimes to take the steps to filter and spray, so that's just me. But why are you applying it? And that will help answer the question. Joala, nice to see you here. Thank you so much for that super sticker. I appreciate the support. You have been one of my longest and most loyal supporters, and I definitely appreciate it. So thank you so much for that, and always nice to have you here on Mondays. And so the Shanine is saying, my German heritage still celebrate May Day in little towns. They still do in maple dances in North Dakota, small towns. So that's nice to know. We were talking about May Day a little earlier ago. I'm going to scroll down and try to get a little more caught up to real time. I know we covered a lot of good stuff today. So it's fantastic that you all have been so involved with your questions, and also the questions that I haven't answered. It's so nice that you're able to help each other out. So that's always fantastic. Dusty Flats is wondering, what is the 1 inch of water a week about? My plants would be dead with so little moisture. You know, this gets back, again, like we were talking about the seed packets a little while ago, with the standard information that you see on seed packets. And not only does it go back a couple generations, but it also goes back, particularly in the United States, to where the seed companies first started, when the whole process was being created. And a lot of that is from the east coast of the United States in pretty rainy regions. And so the assumption is that you're going to get enough natural rainfall that you only need to supplement with 1 inch of water per week. I'm like you. We have single-digit humidity here in Colorado. We're not expecting any rainfall for the next 10 days. It's going to be warm, and especially with my new seedlings that will be sprouting from seeds any day now, 1 inch a week would lead to their death. It's as simple as that. So you have to look at your own individual garden, your own weather and climate, and decide how much your plants need. And it could be more than 1 inch a week if you're not getting supplemental rainfall. If you're getting rainfall on a regular basis, if you live in the UK and many parts of Europe this time of year that are getting a ton of rain, you don't even need water at all. But it's your garden that you have to figure out what's best. So the guidance of 1 inch a week is just information I think that's mostly worthless, because it's never held true for me. The goal is to have your soil evenly moist and then your plants will do well. With an evenly moist soil, the bacterial life, the fungal life, all of those insects that live in the soil will be alive. If you let your soil dry out, all that life dies. And by just watering once a week for an inch at a time, I think it will cause damage for most of us. So I hope that helps. It's one of those guidelines that works for only a portion of the people, and I think actually causes more harm than it really is worth. But when you water, an inch of water is actually a pretty good idea. It's better to do a deep watering less often than to do a light watering every day. And so that's what I try to do. I try to soak my beds as much as possible, and at least ½ inch to an inch when I soak my beds. And in my region, I often have to do that every day. But with the good, rich, amended soil with organic matter and mulch on top, especially early in the season and late in the season, I don't have to do it every day because the mulch is helping hold that moisture in, and the deep watering is getting down to the roots. You have to gauge what's happening with your garden and modify appropriately. Yankee Sister, thank you for that contribution. You're truly amazing. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate it. Enjoyed the live once again. Tops, happy May Day to all. Peace and blessings. And peace and blessings back to you. Thank you so much for that. Always nice to see you here. And I guess you're signing off. I see others that looks like they're saying farewell to you, so I might have missed that comment if you were signing off, but I hope you have a wonderful week. So it's wonderful to have you all here from all others. Ladies Garden and Home says here in Connecticut, and that's where Yankee Sister's from as well. We just had 4 days of torrential rain, and we're expecting another 5 days this week. Can't work in the garden, but the plants that are in have exploded in growth. There you go. 4 days of rain with 5 more rain days. Are you really going to be watering an inch per week anytime soon? No. That's why I say it varies, and it's one of those things that we just have to do what's best for us. You're probably going to be dealing with saturated soil, which hopefully it will drain, but you're definitely not going to be out watering. I'd love to have some of that rain. It's one of those things that I think it was 4 years ago, we had a May, and it rained every day but one in May. It's the rainiest May on record in this part of Colorado, and it was fantastic. Didn't have to water, had to do a lot of weeding that year. In fact, that was at the school garden. I had all of the plants growing, and we were spending an hour to 2 hours every day weeding that garden for the rest of the season because the weeds just exploded because there was so much rain over that period. So be ready for that. If you can get outside and it's really rainy, get a head start on those weeds as soon as possible, or else you'll never catch up. And that was one of those good years and bad years. It was wonderful because so much was growing, but there was so much work because so much was growing. Jordan Marie Organics, nice to see you again. Thank you again for last week's live stream. You motivated me to start working on videos and editing them again. Wonderful. I spent yesterday working on a bunch. So glad to hear that. I look forward to seeing them. And I really liked that picture that you had posted of Jordan Marie next to those beautiful purple flowers. So I'm glad that you're able to get back into that mode. It's wonderful. I was actually out of town last week and had visited my new granddaughter in Oregon. And the week before was just a madman making videos and getting everything set up because I knew I was going to be gone and my normal cycle was going to be off. So sometimes you have to just bite the bullet, bear down, and make things happen like that. But it is fun to make it work when it happens. Luke's wondering, do you plan on making future content on edible functional mushrooms in the garden? Yes, absolutely. And I've tried it. So 2 years ago, I was growing I tried growing mushrooms in straw bales, and of course did all the video and was going to do a video about it. And it was one of those typical Colorado years where we didn't get any rain during that whole cycle of the mushrooms. And I was growing a blue oyster mushroom and got some harvest, delicious mushroom, but it just didn't work out, and I didn't feel it was suitable for a video because I wasn't able to show a lot of what I wanted to show because it was just so dry and I had to water those straw bales so much. So yes, it is part of my plan for the future is to grow more mushrooms in a couple different ways and then have videos about it when it works. I don't want to do a video that shows how nothing works, and that year almost nothing worked with those mushrooms. So look for that. I don't have plans to do it this year, but I do have plans to do it next year. I also have plans to do videos on growing mushrooms indoors with some of those kits you can buy and sit on your kitchen counter and grow mushrooms. So they're coming. They're coming, and I do have plans for that, just not in the immediate future. There's a lot of other stuff that's on the list, and I'm still just trying to catch up with the things that I have planned already without it changing too much. And this weather, you know, got to get outside, got to get those things happening in the garden, and finding time to do something new. As I mentioned weeks ago, there's a lot of, and I did a video about it, what I'm not growing this year. There's a lot I'm not doing this year because I'm trying to just stay caught up and do some more building in areas of my garden. And that's one way to be underwhelmed, like we talked about last week. I'm trying to avoid being overwhelmed by all of the things I want to do. And yeah, mushrooms are on that list. There are a lot of other things on that list of what I want to do. And so it's hard sometimes to rein yourself in and cut back on the activities, but you'll be happier and the garden will be happier if you can actually get to that point. Urban Chicken Mama says, I tested overwintering dahlias in the ground last season. When will I know if they made it? Nothing sprouting up so far. So I would think as the soil temperature increases, if they survive, they're just going to pop up right away. Eli, from In the Garden with Eli and Kate, had a video recently about the dahlias, and most of us are growing them in regions where we have to dig them up and then put them back in the ground. And so I hope yours come up. Based on the fact that most of us are putting them in the ground about this time of year, and then they take a couple weeks to grow, I'm guessing it's probably still a couple weeks before you would see them break the surface. So have a little bit of patience. One option, and I suggest this with all your plants, if you're growing roots or bulbs and you're not sure if they're doing well, then go ahead and just get to that spot and dig down with your fingers down to where the bulb is, or the tuber, or the corm, or whatever it is that you're growing. And you should be able to see growth emerging from that bulb. And that'll give you an indication that everything's okay. If you dig down and you find that it's all shriveled up and rotten, that also answers your question. So don't be afraid to experiment and explore a little bit and dig around the soil in some of those beds, and that might give you an early indicator of whether it's working or whether it's not working. And that might give you time to recover. If you find that they did indeed rot, they didn't make it through the winter in the ground, you still have time to maybe try to find some replacements and put them in the ground, and maybe that would help. So Bohemian Herbology saying, morel slurry under my porch. Nothing yet, but I swear I see white. I read they take up to 3 years. So morel mushrooms, I'm guessing, is what you're talking about. And you could be seeing the white. And so the thing about the mushrooms, and this holds true with all the mushrooms that we'd be growing, you should think about it like any other plant that you're growing in your garden. And so if we grow peppers or tomatoes, we put the plant in, the plant grows, Then it fruits, and we harvest the tomatoes and the peppers as the fruit from those plants. It works the same way with mushrooms. Mushrooms are fungi, and that fungus needs to grow and establish in the soil. And then when it's established, it fruits. And that's what mushrooms are. Mushrooms are the fruit of that particular fungus. And the network is established, and as long as it's in a happy spot, it will continue to fruit over a regular period of time. And so you can expect to get mushrooms yearly. If it's a happy spot, like under a porch that's nice and dark and moist, as long as it's not too cold or too hot, you can expect to get mushrooms. So that's, I don't know specifically about 3 years for morel mushrooms, but yeah, it takes time for those fungal networks to become established depending on the plant. And then it takes additional time for them to fruit and you see the mushrooms. So that white that you're seeing is probably the fungus growing. That's a good sign. It's the mycelia that's starting to spread through that space, and that's what's going to get established, and eventually you'll have the mushrooms as a result of it. So if you're already seeing that white development, it might be less than 3 years. You never know. But if you're expecting 3 years, go ahead and have the patience to wait, and then be excited if it happens to be less than that 3 years. That's always a good way to be excited in the garden. Colorado Bird Nerd, thank you. Learned so again today. So I'm glad you learned. Always nice to have you here. Thank you for that super chat as always. And so those of us in Colorado, and I know that there are those of you up along the Front Range that are on the stream today. And this also holds true for Utah and Wyoming and Montana. All of us in this central part of the United States, we're getting some really good weather right now. It's fantastic. It's the kind of weather we haven't seen in a long time. And it is so easy to get sucked into that mode of, oh, the weather's good. I'm going to go ahead and put the seeds in the ground or put the plants in the ground or do something earlier than normal. This is a huge reason why I encourage the process that you develop for keeping a garden journal. Because here, for me, I've lived here now for 26 years. It happens every year. Every year, the beginning of May is warm. People are going to the stores. They're finding the tomato plants and pepper plants are being sold in the stores in Colorado right now. Our last frost date is anywhere from 2 to 3 weeks from now. And it is normal to have a frost in the 2nd or 3rd week of May. It's so tempting to get out in the garden and to get those things in the ground. But please be careful about succumbing to that desire and putting those plants out and then having that cold come and zap the plants. And all regions have similar weather patterns that once you get used to whatever that pattern happens to be, it can really benefit you with your planting plans. And so while I mentioned earlier, I'm thinking about putting the tomato plants in my greenhouse, I am not thinking at all about putting tomatoes into my garden beds. The soil's too cold. The nights are still too cold. I know there's more snow and ice coming. And anything I put in the ground is going to get zapped and probably killed. So have patience with your gardening, especially if you live in one of the regions like I do, where you're just waiting for winter to be over and you think it's happened. Maybe it hasn't happened yet. I'd much rather you delay things a week too long than to plant a week too early and potentially have no harvest for the rest of the season because the plants that you babied for so long are killed by that unexpected cold. So start keeping track of those kind of things and use that knowledge from one year to the next to benefit you. And yeah, I've planted tomatoes and peppers too early here, and they've been killed, and now I know not to do that. Live and learn. That's part of gardening. I just hope you can avoid some of that if at all possible. D. Birdwell, thank you so much for that super sticker. Nice to have you here as well. I do appreciate all the contributions to the channel. Liz Uppenhuis, thank you, Gardener Scott, for my weekly gardening motivation and inspiration. Oh, you're so welcome, Liz. I hope you can get out and have a wonderful week, get everything done that you want to get done. As with the rest of you, I'm starting to get a little sore at night. I'm sleeping well because the muscles are sore because I am getting outside, and I hope you can get outside. If it's rainy in your area, I hope the rain settles back and drops off soon so that you can get out there and get things done as well, because this is such a wonderful time for all of us. We're not in winter and we're not in summer. We're in the nice spring and fall time of year when the gardens are just so wonderful. So enjoy your gardening. Get out there. I hope you have a fantastic gardening week. And of course, I'll be back next week and we'll do it all over again. Get you motivated, get you excited, and give you some of that information to have success in the garden. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.